Number 10. Marriage.
Poor good women have lost a marriage into war, famine, disease, and disaster.
I know some might think initially that this isn't a punishment, but in the cases of the Victorian women, the societal status of being a woman was only seen based off of the ideologies that needed to be pure and clean. Your bodies were seen as temples, and it shouldn't be decorated with jewelry, nor should it be used for physical activities or your own personal pleasures. You couldn't oppose men, and you being wealthy or a spinster was the only exception. Single women were looked down on with shame and pitied, and as your main purpose as a woman was to marry and reproduce. Even young girls at the age of 8 to 12 would stop working as if there was no child labor laws or protection laws for children, and as soon as these women or young girls were able to menstruate, they would be negotiated into marriage and no longer be able to sustain themselves financially or just be a kid. And being a poor married woman wasn't an option, as you had no individual rights under law. Married women were only seen as one with their husband, and the husband would be the manager and entitled to all of your properties, as it was seen more as a business, and you were being micromanaged constantly until death do you part. Number 9. No rights. As I mentioned with marriage, women didn't have any rights, as they were seen primarily as second-class citizens, and if you were a woman of color, my goodness, you were definitely seen less than human. Women who had to be married ended up losing everything they owned, inherited, or earned, and it would belong to their husband. Once a woman married, control of any property she owned as well as any income she received from it passed to her husband. Although he could not dispose of it without her consent, her property, her personal property such as money or earnings or investments, and personal belongings such as jewelry passed absolutely into his control. She could not part with them without his consent, and if you were in a loveless marriage or a harmful one, you couldn't divorce your husband. Divorce wasn't even a concept for women to execute without losing their own amenities, even in the court of law until the 1970s, almost 100 years or so later, after the spark of the women's suffrage movement in the mid-late 1800s. So men had the right to divorce his wife under the grounds of adultery, but women had to prove her husband was unfaithful, combined with other allegations including cruelty, bigamy, incest, and so on. Luckily, in the 1857 Act, divorce did become a bit easier little by little, but again only under the impression that the woman had legal grounds and proof her husband was unfaithful with evidentiary support to back up her claims. And even then, she could finally earn some of her possessions. As for the husbands, if he wanted to divorce his wife, he didn't have to do anything, he could just say it and it would be fine. Number 8. No education. To me, education is extremely important, as it was something I learned growing up in my family, that education liberates you to understand yourself, those around you, and the world better. And for women in this era, they were received less education than men. They were banned from universities and could only obtain low-income paying jobs, as she was not allowed to follow a profession, as they were all closed to women. And the irony of them having Queen Victoria as the reigning accolade of this era, a woman and women of these times couldn't get an education to liberate herself or her children from defamation if the husband no longer sees her as a useful asset. So for women, especially those who could afford it, was raised in a privileged household with financial backings and exceptional family background, her education was only seen as accomplishments. Like, oh darling, she's a very accomplished woman, is something you might hear in these type of movies that depict the era, which only indicates that she had artistic talents like singing, dancing, and knowing foreign languages, and anything to help earn them a husband and be a benefit in the house. Even doctors at this time believed that if a woman studied too much education, she would stunt her ability to reproduce. Wild as hell. And when university allowed women to attend their lecture halls, their families would actually forbid them from going, worried that it would prevent them from finding a husband. Number 7. The right to work. Work was only available to those who had no choice, as their societal status prevented them from leveling up to the ladder to have a better life independently. Even more so, women who were labeled as part of the working class, these women fueled the industrial revolutions, making up to 60 to 80% of the working force in light industries such as cotton manufacturing. Even more so, those who were labeled as part of the working class, women of this era fueled the industrial revolutions, making up to 60 to 80% of the workforce in light industries such as cotton manufacturing. Women that had jobs outside of the home made them less likely to marry, leaving them with no choice but to stay in undesirable situations that made them undesirable themselves. In one study by the Buffalo State had noticed classing women and children together as helpless creatures needing the protection of strong men. They were indignant at the knowledge that women had to support themselves, that they had suffered degrading wrongs as working women. So for some, they'd have to result themselves into committing adult work, or even for some unfortunate circumstances, be sold into adult work, as they had often had heavy debts from predecessors or even used as bargaining chips for their partners. Poor women were not regarded as the Victorian society, as they could not fight back, as men had captured these women, straight up kidnapping them and kept them at their house. Differences in societal classes led to some women being ignored and unacknowledged in society for economic reasons and for the pleasures of some men. Women of the night had no exits of this profession and were stuck in this life, and they would be beaten, tormented, as this was obviously shamed on, as well as being arrested, which would lead us to number 6. Number 6. Women who were in prison. In some revolutionary standpoints, being in prison might make you look like a hero or a villain, as it depends of what you were doing or what you stood for. For the Victorian era, women who had been the most vocal at this time for a multitude of things like women's rights, the women who were caught in the act of selling their bodies in order to obtain financial means would be arrested and sent to prison. But even women who were not adult workers would be arrested. Women who had premarital pregnancies, truancies, or adultery, or kept bad company would also be arrested. They would be sent to prisons or reformities. As for women of these times, a small step off of the Victorian pedestal made for a long fall. Women sent to prison in the Victorian England were subjected to regimes whose project was to enforce idealized femininity. This individualized treatment aimed at more regeneration than discipline and was administered by an entirely female staff aided by middle-class philanthropic lady visitors. Considering women were placed only into two categories, being a wife and a mother, the reality is that they lived in a world that discriminated heavily against them. Due to their superior physical strength, men considered themselves the dominant sex and sought to keep women subdued for as long as they could. Number 5. Strangulation. Now for the more morbid section on this list, although stoning may seem like a common thing in this era as a form of capital punishment, whereas an individual is pelted with stones until death, actually was not common associated with ancient Egyptian legal practices based on available historical and archaeological evidence. The primary method of execution in ancient Egypt was typically strangulation or impalement. Stoning as a form of capital punishment is more commonly associated with other ancient cultures in the region, such as ancient Mesopotamia or parts of the Levant. In these societies, stoning was indeed known as a form of capital punishment for various offenses, including adultery. Strangulation was one of the most common methods of execution in ancient Egypt. It was typically used for serious offenses and could be applied for both men and women. In cases where capital punishment was deemed necessary, strangulation was a method employed to carry out the sentence. Number 4. Lacerations. When it comes to corporal punishments, as I mentioned above, those who do commit adultery might deal with the consistency of beatings or lacerations. Texts speak of thrashing with a wooden stick, give 10 to 20 to 50 to 100 or even 200 times. They also mention branding and mutilation of the nose and ears. Tomb reliefs often show beatings of people, but in most cases these are private coercions of subordinates, not an official penalty. Sometimes the culprits are bound to a pillory. These punishments were all carried out in public and therefore also meant a loss of honor and degradation of the culprits. The results of these measures can be seen on many skeletons, as they are also including cutting off limbs, noses, and other parts of the body as a form of punishment, specifically connected to adultery or if you were married, specifically a married woman. It is a crime deserving of death, as it is easier to commit any other sin after that. The husband had a legal right to punish or forgive his wife or leave the court if the husband accuses the wife with no proof. The punishment of a man was much lighter, and the woman of the crime of adultery, as the Egyptians believed, that offense falls primarily in the hands of the woman, while the women would be killed as the men would severe just 1,000 blows. Number 3. Burning alive. Referring back to the Code of Hammurabi, the code was enlisted under the morals and the laws in ancient Egypt and Babylon. When it came to intimate relationships with your close family, you'd be subjected to many listed punishments, as in dealing with seduction or physically harming someone intimately. The Hammurabi inflicts the penalty of burning if you were to have a physical intimacy with your mother, but since this was ancient Egypt, unless you were royal who needed to pull an Oedipus complex to maintain your rule and connection to the monarch position, it wasn't something looked down on but normalized, as this is a civilization that needed a monarch rule at all times to guide the nation. But it is good to note that it was a typical Western interpretation that this era was prone to burning alive people, when the irony was that the Europeans burning women, being witches or even more heresy, were more burned. Number 2. Head be gone. The ancient Egyptians set harsh punishments for those accused of treason or corruption. The death penalty was usually applied by impalement, thumping, or a 100-fold fine, and this applied to both men and women. The decree also referred to the death penalty for someone who steals an animal belonging to the temple and transfer it to another party, while confiscating the property of the thief in favor of the stolen temple. The ancient Egyptians distinguished between the stolen goods and the attribute of holiness, and considered it a religious crime that requires execution, and those stolen goods that do not affect the sanctities, settling for the penalties of beating and the fine for the theft 100 times of the value of the stolen items. Number 1. Buried alive. Of course, all of these leads to death eventually, as the punishments were drastic, dangerous, violent, and vile. I mean, if you somehow survived the beheading, then what a miracle that would be. But death was only reserved for the extreme measures of punishment for women of these times. As I mentioned, there was very minimal, if not just the common punishment of corporal punishment. The scariest, in my opinion, would be buried alive. In some cases, individuals might be sentenced to be buried alive, although this was likely a very rare extreme form of punishment, most likely only reserved for the ones with extreme cases of crime. It's important to keep in mind that our knowledge of specific cases and punishment in ancient Egypt is limited, as much of what we know is derived from inscriptions, legal texts, and other historical records. Additionally, practices may have varied over time and in different distant regions of ancient Egypt. The legal systems and punishments evolved over the millennia, so there could be variations in practices depending on the specific period within ancient Egypt history. Violence against women is a human rights violation, potentially touching on the rights to life, to equality, to liberty, and security of persons, to equal protection under the law, to be free from all forms of discrimination and violence, to the highest standard attainable of physical and mental health, to just the favorable conditions to work, as well as the rights to not subjected to and cruel, inhumane, degrading treatment. And although the cruelty and damages to women was abhorrent and tragic, it still lingers in our day, as now 60% of women still don't report crimes due to fear of shame and stigma. But we still need to be safe spaces to those who need reassurance so that they can speak up. We still got a lot of work to do, you know? Number 10, thews or stalks. Gossiping now is always seen as a bothersome and terrible construct where rumors are spread and information is sent from one end to the room to the other, when in actuality the original history of gossiping was used as a survival tool since time. However, due to the trickling events that would occur in the 12th century to the 21st century, gossip has been accompanied by the dangerous stigmatization of women. And with that in mind, they would be accompanied with a crime of humiliation for gossiping by being locked up by the neck and left outside at the mercy of the mocking crowd. The thew was a type of pillory similar to stocks specifically for women, and the woman would be chained to a post by her neck as a punishment for her crime. Unlike men, her hands weren't tied up, and common crimes include annoying your neighbors by talking too much or consummating outside of marriage. As for example, one woman named Anne Morrow in 1777, she was accused of impersonating a man and marrying another woman. She was put in the pillory and an angry crowd stoned her, and resulting of her being blind. Number 9, iron cages. They really didn't like it when women gossiped, or in most cases talked back in the day, especially when she would speak up or just discuss things. But words can only help you unless you speak them, and it's disappointing when people fail to understand that. Women who nagged would have metal spikes forced into their mouths, and the scold bridle was an iron cage for a woman's face, used to punish scolds, women who nagged, gossiped, talked back, or just talked too much. The bridle would be locked onto your head, and the protruding piece of metal will cover in spikes would be forced inside your mouth, and every time you moved your tongue, the spikes would lacerate it. Sometimes the bridal woman would be chained to a hook by the fireplace in her home until she had learned her lesson, or she might be led through town wearing the mask to increase her humiliation. Number 8, duck the scold. Unfortunately, another form of torment and punishment for women being tied to a chair at the end of a long, maneuverable wooden arm and dipped into frigid water. The punishment wasn't designed to be fatal, although sometimes it was, but rather a humiliating spectacle aimed at discouraging whatever behavior participated in it. There were various rituals for silencing women, as they have their roots in fear of women's speech and fear that women will attack other people in their community, that they gossip too much, that their voices were dangerous, and that they may, in extreme circumstances, also be witches. Though the women who ended up being on the ducking stool risked being accused of witchcraft, and the punishment, contrary to popular misconception, wasn't used to determine whether someone was a witch. A separate test, primarily known as the swimming witch, involved throwing a bound victim into a body of water to see if they'd float, a sure sign of guilt in the modern imagination. Subjects who sank were deemed innocent but could still wind up dead if they weren't rescued from the water in time. Few records about the women who were ducked survived. Much more information is available about the ducking stools themselves, their upkeep, about how they were kept into their construction. Number 7, marking and tattooing. Although in some cultures tattooing isn't seen as a bad thing, but part of their heritage and even a source of pride. But in some cases, they would use it as a means of marking an individual for their shame. Nathaniel Hawthorne, The Scarlet Letter, famously marks its protagonist, Hester Prynne, with a red letter A for adultery for accusations about her behavior circulated. Hawthorne's book is more than fiction, as adulterers were really forced to mark their clothing to identify their crimes. Like Hester Prynne, A or the letters AD as outlined by a Plymouth colony law from 1658, adulterers seen publicly without their letters were subject to public whipping and even further humiliation and social alienation. But keep in mind, Hawthorne was the descendant of the Judge Hathorne, who persecuted the lives of women who were accused of being witches, and he had such a disdain for his relative that he had changed his last name to distance himself from the relation of Hathorne from Hawthorne with a W. Number 6, Walk of Shame. Like in Game of Thrones, a pretty well-known show, I don't know if you guys heard of it, I'm rewatching it again up to a certain specific season. But there was that scene where Cersei was condemned for her crimes and had that lady yell shame as she rung a bell while Cersei was left parading the streets stripped naked. This is actually based as a form of torment for women, and the Walk of Shame, also known as skimmington or rough music, was a traditional punishment for harlotry or being an overbearing wife. Women were made to walk barefoot through the town or city, sometimes dressed only in their petticoat. The street was filthy and sharp with rough stones, jeering crowds lined up to stare, and minstrels banging basins and pans would accompany the procession, adding to the woman's humiliation. Sometimes the skimmingtons were delivered by the townsfolk rather than the courts, and the accused might be dragged from their bed at night and paraded through the town with the crowd shouting obscene words at her. Unless she was quiet, subdued woman who followed every little thing she was supposed to do, she would be looked down on.
Number 5 is also used to shut wives and women up. It's the Shrew Fiddle and Fife. But I could be wrong. It could be pronounced fife like the country, fee or thief like thief, cannot tell for the life of me. Anyways, you've heard the boring shrew scold 100 times. I'm here to bring you a new exciting product if you want to publicly shame some women, but also simultaneously make it look like they're starting medieval times' most vibing jazz band. The Shrew Fiddle, or shame fiddle, was a wooden contraption shaped roughly like a fiddle, or a fife, or fief, or whatever it is, which is a type of flute that acted like a portable stocks for your fingers and your neck. The shame flute was specifically designed to punish those who made bad music. However, these Shrew's implements are titled after the ladies that were tossed in them constantly, people who spoke up to their husbands or argued with one another. The next 4 titles on this list, I'm not kidding, are all rippers of some kind. We're gonna start with number 4, the chest ripper. If I instinctually put my hands on my chest while we're talking, you will understand why in a second. This was a device made specifically and only for women to destroy a very specific aspect of femininity and thus remove what the medieval people perceived to be her desirability. And man, did these dudes have a weird ass fixation on doing stuff to breasts. Burned, brand, carved, or simply amputated. This is called sensual torture, but swap the N and the S for the letter X. It extends back to the time of ancient Rome and likely long before then too, but worst of all was a device coined in medieval England known as the breast ripper, a metal claw that pierced the flesh of the breast of the victim who was tied down and then pulled away forcibly, shredding it to pieces. It was used as both a method of punishment to mark breasts of unmarried mothers and women convinced of heresy, adultery, and hosts of other crimes, but also for interrogation, because nothing is gonna make someone confess to being a witch faster than a sociopath with a giant pair of tongs. Number 3 is a rear ripper. It's unlikely, but if there was anything worse than the breast ripper, it's probably the pair of anguish. Recognizable now from video games and movies and leather bedrooms with red latex accents, this pear-shaped device was one of the many horrific devices that made it to the modern world, but was reborn with better purposes. A few medical devices have taken a page out of its book, such as the dreaded thing they use at gynecology appointments, and some birthing and colonoscopy gear. So, the pear is made up of 4 leaves. These are joined at the hinge at the top and a key or a crank on one end. As you can see on screen, it's named accordingly. The pear was inserted into one of the 3 viable orifices, 2 if it's a dude, depending on the nature of the crime committed. The oral device was reserved for heretics, while the back door and the middle door pairs were used on, you could never guess. Witches, witchcraft, ooh. Man, medieval times must have looked like the set of Halloween Town, the way that witchcraft is constantly referenced. Anyways, turning the key opened the leaves, and every little click of the key causes massive internal damage that was rarely fatal, but very thorough way to get a confession out of someone, or just about anything. I'm pretty sure the average person would admit to something as ludicrous as riding a magic donkey out of the king's palace if it meant that would stop. Number 2 is another rear ripper. Yeah, they liked those. Come to think of it, for such a essentially repressed society, they seem to get quite raunchy with their punishments. It's almost like that's the reason you shouldn't repress feelings like that. The Judas cradle, also known as the gilded cradle, was a regular stool with a wooden or metal pyramid on the top. The victim would be stripped, tied with ropes on all 4 limbs, and then like some elaborate Marvel movie setup behind the scenes, they get lifted into the air and suspended just over top of the pyramid. Then their bits are adjusted to sit right on top of the pyramid. From here, the captive holder could torment them further, try to get confessions, whatever, before letting loose more and more of the person's own body weight, which would slowly impale them downwards on the pyramid, which in turn would start making room for itself. This punishment method was frequently used in the Inquisition, but I invite you to guess when else. Could it be A, witchcraft, B, witchcraft, or C, witchcraft? If you guessed any of those 3, you're right, because pretty much every medieval punishment for a woman was because she talked too much or made a soup that tasted too good, so the devil must have done it. Alright, the last in our little ripping montage, number 1 is the rail rip, aka a wooden horse, also known as riding the rail. It's an eft device of which there are 2 variations. The first is like a balance beam from gymnastics but triangular, mounted on a sawhorse-like support. The victim is made to straddle the triangular horse and place their full body weight down on the hoo-ha area, which rested on the blunt point of the angle. Weights and additional restraints were added to keep the victim from falling off, but also to drag them down. Left for days, it can begin destroying your pelvis as well as dislocate all of the joints in your legs. A less immediately painful variation is a single plank of wood supported, again with the wooden legs or sometimes suspended from the ceiling, horizontal from the floor on its side with a thin edge and sharpened extremely. The victim is made to straddle the plank, which is adjusted to their height so that they have to stand on their tiptoes or let their hoo-ha, meet a very serrated fate. This wasn't a witchcraft one ironically, but rather for adulterers, working girls, or women who breathed a little too hard and their husbands wanted them gone.
Number 10. Drowning. Drowning as a form of punishment was not a common practice in ancient Egypt, at least as far as historical records and archaeological evidence indicate. The ancient Egyptians had a legal system with various forms of punishment, but the various methods were typically less severe than drowning. But in records of the Code of Hammurabi, which was one of the oldest and known legal codes in human history, it provided a comprehensive set of laws covering a wide range of aspects of daily life, including civil, criminal, and commercial matters. One of the most famous aspects of the code is the principle of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, which laid out specific punishments for various offenses. Mentioning drowning if there was adultery with a neighbor's wife, or if you had intimate relations with your daughter-in-law, more or less these punishments would go both ways, but interestingly enough, the laws depended on the person. Number 9. Disinheritance. In ancient Egypt, inheritance and property rights were complex and evolved over time, with some variations depending on the specific period and social status of individuals. Generally, women did have rights to inherit property, but there was significant differences between men and women in terms of inheritance. During the early dynastic periods, women had relatively more rights and they could inherit and own property. However, as the society became more stratified and centralized with the rise of the pharaonic state, inheritance laws became in favor more for males. By the time of the Middle Kingdom, women's rights to property and inheritance were gradually eroded. Property, especially land, was usually passed from father to son. Women could gain property through marriage contracts, dowries, or gifts, which they could then pass on to their children. But if they lose their inheritance, so do their children. Thankfully, there was legitimate ways of structuring a will, making unequal distributions of disinheriting a person so to minimize challenges which do not involve corporal punishment. These include a gift conditional upon the recipient not challenging the will, a no contest clause diverting assets outside the will by writing a life insurance policy into trust, or passing assets through the will to a secret trust. Number 8. Banishment. In ancient Egypt, as in many ancient societies, the legal system was complex and the punishment for various offenses could vary depending on factors such as the severity of the crime, the societal status of an individual involved, and the time period in question. Banishment was one possible punishment, but it was not the common form of punishment. Banishment in ancient Egypt was being expelled from a community or city was generally used for serious offenses or crimes. It was a severe punishment because it meant the individual was cut off from their community and likely left to fend for themselves in the harsh environment outside settled areas. And for women, it was typically a rare occurrence as the legal system in ancient Egypt was based on the code of law that changed over time, and evidence suggests that women could be subjected to various forms of punishments for their crimes, including banishment. Number 7. Punishment. More commonly, punishments for women in ancient Egypt might have included fines, corporal punishments, or forced labor. For serious crimes, especially those that threatened the social order or involved treason, more severe punishments like execution might be applied, but in some cases for less serious offenses, women might be required to pay fines. These fines could be in the form of money, goods, or livestock. Women, particularly those of lower social status, could be sentenced to perform labor as a form of punishment. This might involve agriculture work, construction, or other forms of manual labor. Depending on the nature of the offense, a woman's property or belongings could be confiscated as a form of punishment. As mentioned earlier, banishment was a possible punishment for serious offenses. Number 6. Beatings. In ancient Egypt, like in many ancient societies, corporal punishment, including beatings, could be a form of punishment for women, particularly for offenses that were considered serious or morally reprehensible according to the prevailing nature and culture and legal norms. It's important to note that the application of punishment varied depending on factors such as societal status and specific time period and the region within ancient Egypt. Corporal punishments such as whipping, beating, or other forms of physical punishment could be administered for various offenses. This might be more common for crimes like theft or adultery. Examples would be like switches, flexible branches, or vines could have been used for beatings. They would be capable of inflicting pain without causing severe injury, as wooden paddles with a flat surface could also be used for beating as well. They would also have been effective in delivering blows to specific areas of the body, and the simplest form of beating would be involved with the hands and fists. This method would also be easily accessible and wouldn't have to require any specialized tools, as well as whips, sticks, and rods. Number 5. Prison life. Being accused of being an idle and disorderly woman seems like a very vague and inconvenient statement today, as it holds no worthy of prosecution. But for these women of these times, you would definitely go to jail for that. These roughly defined offenses were common charges against women in the 18th century. At least in some records of the names of these women have survived, there are 2 on the list who are silently identified, only known as an unknown woman, cannot give any account of herself, and the other being accused of being a vagrant and an idiot. Which, of course, being an idiot isn't a crime unless you're doing something idiotic that hurts another person. Then yeah, I guess being an idiot is a crime. It is possible that up to 2/3 of prisoners in the House of Corrections, like the one at the prison called the Wakefield House of Correction, were female. Beating hemp was the usual form of hard labor. as well as if the women refused to comply or being able to commit to tasks, whipping and beatings were also a commonplace, particularly to those who convicted of vagrancy, lewd conduct, and night walking. Number 4, domestic harm. This is sort of stemming back to the whole marriage thing in number 10, as it basically ties in on how horrible life was being a woman in the Victorian era, or just being a woman in general in any historical time. With these sacrifices and determinations of these women, as they ensured the women like me were able to gain access slowly but surely to equal rights, but sadly when it comes to marriage for some of these women, they're also at risk of being in harmful relationships that were extremely normalized at the time. Violence against women and the lack of protection was common, as there were no laws for the physical violations they had to endure. After all, when you got married, everything you owned belonged to your husband, and so did your body, with or without consent. Domestic violence was an issue that captivated the Victorian imagination due to the unprecedented visibility that domestic harm began to receive in the press and the emergence of an ongoing debate during the 1840s and the 1850s. Domestic violence was an issue that captivated the Victorian imagination due to the unprecedented visibility that domestic harm began to receive in the press and the emergence of an ongoing debate during the 1840s and 1850s about the domestic harm and other marriage issues that affected women. Like all laws that slowly opened gateways to other clauses, the 1828 Offences Act that targets working class violence helped a cultural shift on the subject, and domestic violence became a topic to the public. Number 3, the angel of the house. Or the angel in the house. When it came to the liberation, it all stemmed with the women's rights groups fought for equality and over time made strides in attaining rights and privileges. However, many Victorian women endured their husband's control and even cruelty, including sensual violence, verbal abuse, and economic deprivation. And there's no way out of it, as it got worse, as a man named Coventry Patmore published a book called Angel in the House. It consisted of poems and the ideal Victorian marriage, and although it came from a place of grief at the loss of his first wife, the book had suddenly become a staple in women's behaviors in marriages, and then became a standard of their status. A woman's proper role was to love, honor, and obey her husband, as her marriage vows stated. A wife's place in the family hierarchy was secondary to her husband, but far from being considered unimportant. A wife's duty to tend to her husband and properly raise her children were considered crucial cornerstones of social stability by the Victorians. Representations of ideal wives were abundant in Victorian culture, providing women of their role models, and the Victorian ideal of the tirelessly patient, sacrificing wife is what depicted the angel in the house. And for these middle-class women, mimicking the angel in the house gave them more opportunities to find a successful match in marriage. Number 2, the House General. The House General, and a term coined in 1861 by Isabella Beeton in her influential manual, Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management, because for women they needed a manual on how to be a good wife, a good woman, and a good so on and so forth. Here she explained that the mistress of the house is comparable to the commander of an army or the leader of an enterprise. To run a respectful household and secure the happiness and comfort and well-being of her family, she must perform her duties intellectually and thoroughly. For example, she had to organize, delegate, and instruct her servants, which was not an easy task as many of them were not reliable. Isabella Beeton's upper-class readers may also have a large complement of domestics, a staff requiring supervisions by mistress of the house. Beeton's advised her readers to maintain a housekeeping account book to track spending. She recommends entries and checking the balance monthly, but also keep in mind this is the same lady who told people to put borax in bread to save money. This may not seem like a big punishment for some viewers, but if you were told that you needed a manual to how to live your life so you wouldn't be kicked out of society, that's not something that's a preference today, is it? And number 1, asylum. Now, if you're a woman who was out of the realms and just didn't want to be part of society like everyone else, maybe just suffered a series of mental health issues or even just looked ugly, you might find yourself in an asylum. They had such ridiculous reasons to lock up a woman, as I mentioned in the prison section on this list. From being a vagrant, disorderly, or whatever the case was, you'd go to prison, or even more so, to the asylum. For some families, if they just didn't know what to do with you, they just toss you into the asylum for not being complicit. In an investigation by a very passionate and amazing writer named Nellie Bly, she had experienced firsthand on the field of the mistreatments, the devastating conditions, and harm patients had to endure. In her report published in 1887 and later published in the book 10 Days in the Madhouse, it caused such a sensation it prompted the asylum to implement reforms and shed the light on the significant impact on American culture. Anyways, being a woman was tough as hell in the Victorian era, but with their determination for the right to vote, the women's suffrage movement that enforced lawmakers to ensure them to obtain sustainability today is the reason why there are so many genuinely incredible women who are able to become who they want to be. And it is important to note those who do not know how to look back at where they came from will never get to their destination. So be sure to read up and learn a lot. After all, the answer in our future is laid dormant in our past.
Such as the first one to make me puke, number 10, denailing. It's one of those torment styles I feel needs no explanation. The name kinda says it all, but to include you in the horror, the definition of denailing is the forcible extraction of fingernails or toenails or both. And man, was it a favorite method of the medieval times. And a fun fact I learned, the term cutting it to the quick actually originates with this horrible punishment. The quick is the nickname for the fingernail skin, aka hypocochium. So when you're cutting it to the quick, you're digging up someone's fingernails. In its simplest form, denailing was done by first constraining the prisoner on whatever tabletop or chair, whatever you got ready to tie a person to. Then metal forceps or pliers, often heated over fire until red hot, grasp each nail at its edge and tear it from its nail or toe bed. Okay, Ma, this right here is why I am okay with the fact you never broke my nail biting habit. Unfortunately for me, the other variant of this would have still worked because in version 2, they wedged something under the nail first and then hit it inwards to separate the nail from its bed. This was a favored method of the medieval German witch hunters who would dip the wooden skewers in boiling sulfur before wedging them in, which would burn the incredibly sensitive flesh of the underside of the nail. When enough skewers have been driven home to ply each nail loose from the bed, only then is the nail torn from the root with a pair of pliers. Okay, one and done. Let's hit number 9, which is stocks. And just like the stock market, it's scary and confusing. The people involved are sitting on their ass. Sorry, the joke was there, I had to go for it. So, stock is both physical torment and public humiliation, the best of both types of medieval punishments. Okay, so you know that thing where they bend you over and they put your head and your wrists in it like this, as seen in the beautiful period piece Shrek? The stocks are similar, but for your feet. Difference is that a person is placed in the stocks sitting with their legs extended in front of them and their feet are locked into place. Sometimes their hands or their head might be chained for funsies too, but overall they're left lying on the ground, or if they're lucky, they have something under their butt. Stocks could be found in the most public places available, where a town crier would come out shaking that big ass bell and telling the bored masses they could contribute to punishing offenders against the standard of conduct of the time, aka free-for-all. See this defenseless person literally lying on the ground having an existential crisis because all they did was have a pimple that looked kind of like a witch spot and now their feet are in a Lego block? Get some repressed unacknowledged feelings out. Feel free to berate, attack, spit, kick, urinate, defecate, or even violate the man or woman in their immovable state. This was super popular among civil authorities in medieval times and was at its peak use during the Elizabethan England and the Spanish conquistadors tormenting those in the New World who fought back against Christianization. It was not uncommon for people to be kept in stocks for several days to die of hypothermia or heat stroke. Number 8 is the Catherine wheel, which was named after Saint Catherine of Alexandria, who wasn't ever actually killed on one of these, but the fictitious story stuck and so did the name. So, medieval France and Germany loved this bad boy, which was essentially a giant cartwheel put on a lazy Susan. Folks would be stretched out on it and then tied down, then quite literally became a wheel of fortune, because ideally the dude wielding the massive hammer taking swings at you while you slowly spin in a circle gets dizzy and misses. More often than not though, folks ain't that lucky. This wheel would be spun nice and slow over the hours, and the hammer wielder would break different limbs as they circled past him. Once all the limbs were reduced to spiky bone fragment skin slabs, sorry, but the person was left on the wheel to die. It could take hours, even days, before shock and dehydration did its course. If your offense was less severe, or you could bribe someone, or you were at least well liked, the first blow would be to the neck in hopes of smoking you quickly, known as coup de grâce, aka blows of mercy. Otherwise, they went from the feet up, baby, and the number of sequences of blows are specified in the court sentence. How, as a lady, did you earn the Catherine's wheel? Cheating, witchcraft, treason. Next up for number 7 is the piquette, the perfect device for your DIY executioner. All you need is a stake, a hole in the ground to stick it out of, some rope, and a little bit of friendship. It was usually used as a military punishment, however the piquette did make its rounds, even ending up in a famous illustration of a woman being subjected to it during the French Revolution. Alright, so what you need to pick up from your Hobby Lobby or your Michael's Craft Store is a stake. You're gonna stick one end of it in the ground and then the exposed end facing upwards. Make sure to grab a saw and sandpaper because you're gonna need that exposed end to be sharpened to a rounded point, not a pointy point. Now grab some rope and your malefactor, who is typically a soldier who had disobeyed order or a woman accused of witchcraft or sleeping around. You're gonna use that rope to suspend them from the tree by this region of the thumb, while the sole of their opposite bare foot was balanced on top of the stake. The point of the stake was sharp enough to jab into the arch uncomfortably, but not enough to pierce your foot. Want to get the pressure off? You have to regulate all your body weight into the thumb that's suspending you. And yes, you may be thinking, wouldn't that tear your thumb from its socket? Absolutely, which is why you'd shift your weight back onto the painful foot. Pretty ingenious methodology, if you ask me. Nobody died, but some people did lose thumbs. Better than your life, though. This is a classic mention on our channel. Number 6 is the shame masks. If they tried to use those on us today, I personally don't think it'd work. The way that pride and ego function in modern days is so different from olden times, but back then, I guess it must have been an efficient humiliation tactic for them to have so many of these horrible masks. That, or people really vibe with the Halloween vibe. These masks, as mentioned, are meant to humiliate, and I guess there's nothing more humiliating than being compared to a pig or a rooster. 2 of their most common designs. Some would have a pig snout, bird beak, devil horns, donkey ears. Bells are sometimes attached to attract the attention to the wearer, or even whistles attached to the mouthpiece, so anytime they breathe, this stupid thing would make a sound like the Tin Man from Wizard of Oz was approaching. Although less vicious than many other torments, they could still be painful and distressing, especially if your sentence is a long one. The mask can make it difficult to eat, drink, sleep, and could attract violence from hostile people or lecherous men. They were used as punishments for various misdemeanors, but usually it was to shut a woman up. Literally. You scolded your husband, that's a serious sin that contravened the Bible's clear instructions for wives to remain subservient little... Well, I was gonna say Barbie dolls, but maybe after the movie, it's Ken's.
Number 5, status degration. Status degration still persists today, and it's been used as a formal punishment throughout history. Under the Roman Emperor Augustus, who reigned from 27 BCE to 14 CE, a woman guilty of adultery could lose several rights as a citizen and suffer a financial burden. Noble women in the Kingdom of Korea during the Chosun dynasty faced a similar degradation of their social status if they were found guilty of adultery or if they just remarried. Adulteresses were stripped of many of their rights and privileges once they were demoted to low-born status, and the descendants of widows who remarried were barred from holding office. As serious as these punishments may seem, some high-status women who committed adultery in the Chosun dynasty faced even graver punishment, which is death. Number 4, pricking and scratching. Another form of torment women had to endure as a type of punishment relates back towards one of the biggest torments women had to face during the witch trials. Witch hunting books and instruction pamphlets, yes, they had an IKEA manual on how to prick a witch. It noted that marks were insensitive to pain and they couldn't bleed. So they would make these specifically designed needles to repeatedly stab and prick at the accused flesh until they discovered a spot that produced their desired results. So basically they would just keep poking you with needles until there was an area on you that just didn't bleed. They even had a job position for this called professional prickers, which many of them would be con men using dulled needles points to identify fake witch marks. Alongside the pricking was the scratching, where they would scratch the supposed victim. So if a victim scratches the accused witch with their fingernails and drew blood and their symptoms of being possessed stopped, then somehow that person that they scratched was a witch. Number 3, tar and feathering. When I first heard about tar and feathering, it was in a cartoon where the characters would use tar and then feather the characters they wanted to make a fool out of. Tar and feathering originated as a punishment that dates back to Richard I of England. The practice of tarring and feathering was exported to the Americas, gaining popularity in the mid-18th century. Throughout the 1760s, it saw increased usages as a means of protesting the Townshend Revenue Act and those who sought to enforce it. For women, they'd also tar and feather as a form of embarrassment. In a news article in 1906, consisting of 4 young married women from the East Sandy, Pennsylvania, corrected the alleged evil conduct of their neighbor, Mrs. Hattie Lowry. 2 women held Mrs. Lowry to the floor while the others 2 smeared her face with stove polish until it was completely covered and then poured thick molasses on her head and emptied the contents of a feather pillow over molasses. The women then marched the victim to a railroad camp tied by the wrist, where 200 workmen stopped to watch the spectacle. After parading Mrs. Lowry through the camp, the women tied her to a large box where she remained until a man released her. They did this because they wanted to be part of a vigilant committee which exercises the right to take up the law in their own hands. Reason why they did that to her, though, is still unknown. Justice for Mrs. Lowry. Number 2, amputation. Although it may not seem to be as creative as the other instruments of torture on this list, amputation packed a painful and permanent punch. The body of an ancient Chinese woman from about 3,000 years ago have been found with an amputated feet but in otherwise good health, and all signs point to an ancient Chinese punishment called yue, which was used for over 500 different offenses, including cheating and stealing. In ancient Egypt and the Byzantine Empire, a different type of amputation was common, nose amputation, called rhinotomy, which was a punishment for adulterous women, though it was also used as a punishment for various crimes in medieval and ancient times elsewhere. However, the adulterous man might escape with a less severe punishment like a fine or a beating. Number 1, burnt to death. Although it is noted that the most famous form of torment and method of getting rid of a witch was to burn her or burn them by the stake, but this was more common in Europe during the very early 1300s to the end of the 17th century. In England and most of their colonies, the witch trials would go on like every other crime, and when someone was convicted of witchcraft, typically they would be hanged. But with the burning alive, that was more specifically used in Europe, especially in Scotland. Women accused of witchcraft and communing with the devil would be burnt, but it was also also a common punishment for treason or heresy. A woman might have her limbs covered in tar, as well as being made to wear a tar-soaked dress and bonnet, and she would then be tied up by the neck on a barrel and the fire would be lit. She would be simultaneously burnt and hung in a blazing inferno, or they wouldn't bother to hang her, instead placing a bundle of twigs around her feet so she would be consumed in a sheet of fire and burnt alive. Notably, another famous person who was also in this unfortunate spectacle was Joan of Arc.